David pushed his cleaning cart through the empty hallways of the Grand Theater, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished marble floor. It was just past 11 at night, and the last of the audience members had finally left after tonight's symphony performance. The theater felt different when it was empty like this. All those fancy people in their expensive clothes were gone, leaving behind only the faint smell of perfume and the scattered programs on the floor. He had been working here for almost 3 years now, ever since everything in his life had turned upside down. 3 years since his wife passed away suddenly, leaving him alone with 2 little girls to raise. 3 years since he had to give up everything he thought his life would be, and take whatever job he could find that paid the bills. The Grand Theater wasn't a bad place to work, really. The pay was decent enough to cover rent and groceries, and his supervisor mostly left him alone as long as the place was spotless by morning. But every single night as he walked through these halls filled with music and dreams, he felt like he was living in some kind of strange joke. You see, David knew this place better than most people who performed here, not because he had worked here for 3 years, but because he had studied every corner of it during his college days. Back when he was a music student, he used to sneak in through the back doors just to sit in the empty seats and imagine himself on that stage. Back when he still believed that talent and hard work were enough to make dreams come true. His daughters, Lucy and Grace, were 7 and 9 years old now. They had no idea that their dad used to spend hours every day practicing piano, that he had once been good enough to get a scholarship to the state music college, or that he had even performed in small concerts around town. To them, he was just dad who came home tired every night, helped them with homework, made dinner, and tucked them into bed with stories about brave princesses and talking animals. David had made a choice to keep his musical past buried. What was the point in telling them about dreams that would never come true? What good would it do to explain that he had once been able to make beautiful music, when now he spent his nights emptying trash cans and mopping floors? Tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was because the pianist who had performed earlier reminded him so much of his old music professor. The way the man's fingers had moved across the keys, the way he had leaned into the emotional parts of the piece, it had stirred something in David that he had worked very hard to keep quiet. As he entered the main theater hall, David paused for a moment. The stage lights were dimmed but still glowing softly, casting long shadows across the empty seats. At the center of it all sat the grand piano, a beautiful black Steinway that probably cost more than David would make in 10 years. He had cleaned around that piano hundreds of times, always careful not to touch the keys, always respectful of the instrument that represented everything he had lost. But tonight something was pulling him toward it. David parked his cart at the side of the stage and climbed the steps slowly. His work boots felt heavy and out of place on the polished wooden floor where so many talented musicians had stood. He approached the piano bench and sat down carefully, as if the instrument might disappear if he moved too quickly. His hands rested on his knees for a long moment. These hands that now spent their time scrubbing and cleaning had once been able to create something beautiful. His fingers were rougher now, with small scars from cleaning supplies and calluses in different places than they used to be. But when he flexed them slightly, he could still feel the muscle memory of years of practice. David looked out at the empty theater seats. Row after row of red velvet chairs, each one representing a person who had come here tonight expecting to be moved by music. People who had paid good money to feel something special, to be transported somewhere beyond their everyday lives. He thought about Lucy and Grace, probably fast asleep in their beds at home. The babysitter, Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, was watching them like she did every night. His girls had never heard him play piano. They had never seen that part of who he used to be. Sometimes, late at night when he was sure they were sleeping, David would sit at their old keyboard in the closet. It wasn't much, just a cheap electronic piano he had bought years ago when money was even tighter than it was now. The keys didn't feel right and some of them stuck, but it was better than nothing. He would put on headphones and play very quietly, just to keep his fingers from forgetting completely. But this piano in front of him now was different. This was a real instrument, the kind he had dreamed of owning someday. The kind that could make music that would fill every corner of this huge theater and reach into people's hearts. David lifted the lid that covered the keys, wincing slightly at the small noise it made in the silence. The black and white keys seemed to glow in the soft stage lights. He placed his right hand over middle C, the way his first piano teacher had shown him when he was just 8 years old. That teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had told him he had real talent. She said his fingers were naturally suited for piano and that with practice he could go far. She was the one who had encouraged him to audition for the music program at college. She was the one who believed in him when his own parents thought music was a waste of time. David wondered what Mrs. Patterson would think if she could see him now. Would she be disappointed that he had given up? Or would she understand that sometimes life forces you to make choices you never wanted to make? He pressed one key very softly. The note rang out clear and pure in the empty theater, seeming to hang in the air forever. It was perfect, exactly the way a piano should sound. Rich and full and alive. Before he could stop himself, David played a simple scale. His fingers moved automatically, remembering patterns they had practiced thousands of times. The sound was incredible. Every note was crisp and beautiful, filling the space around him with music. For just a moment, David forgot where he was. He forgot about the mop bucket waiting for him and the floors that still needed cleaning. He forgot about the bills waiting at home and the worry that kept him awake at night. For just a moment, he was a musician again. David's fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the piano keys. The simple scale he had just played seemed to echo in his mind, awakening memories he had tried so hard to bury. He looked around the empty theater once more, making sure he was truly alone. The security guard wouldn't make his rounds for another hour, and the cleaning supervisor had already gone home for the night. Something inside him was breaking open, like a dam that had been holding back water for too long. All those nights of silent practice on the broken keyboard at home. All those times he had walked past this very piano pretending it meant nothing to him. It all felt like a lie he had been telling himself. David placed both hands on the keys properly now, his fingers finding their natural positions without conscious thought. It had been so long since he had played on a real piano, but his body remembered. His hands remembered. He started with something simple, a piece by Bach that he had learned in his first year of college. The notes came slowly at first, hesitant and careful. But as the familiar melody began to take shape, something magical happened. The music seemed to pour out of him, note by note, like he was uncorking a bottle that had been sealed for years. The sound filled the entire theater, reaching every corner of the vast space. This wasn't like playing on his little keyboard at home with headphones on. This was real music in a real concert hall, the way it was meant to be heard. The piano responded to every touch of his fingers, every subtle change in pressure creating different shades of sound. David closed his eyes and let himself fall into the music completely. His fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, finding their old rhythm and grace. Years of practice came flooding back. All those hours spent in practice rooms, all those lessons with professors who had pushed him to be better, all those dreams of someday playing in a place exactly like this. As the Bach piece came to an end, David felt tears on his cheeks. He hadn't even realized he was crying. The silence that followed seemed even deeper than before, as if the theater itself was holding its breath. But instead of stopping, David found himself moving into another piece. This time it was Chopin, a nocturne that he had played at his senior recital in college. It was the same piece he had played for his wife on their wedding day, when they had found an old piano in the corner of the reception hall and everyone had gathered around to listen. The memory of that day hit him like a physical blow. His wife had stood beside the piano, her wedding dress flowing around her, her eyes shining as she listened to him play. She had always believed in his music, even when he started to doubt himself. She was the one who had encouraged him to keep performing, to keep chasing his dreams even when they seemed impossible. After she died, music had felt like another loss. How could he play the songs that reminded him of her? How could he find joy in something that now only brought pain? It had been easier to pack away the music with all the other pieces of his old life. But sitting here now, playing her favorite piece, David felt something different. Instead of just pain, there was something else mixed in with the sadness. Love, maybe. Gratitude for the time they had together. A kin of peace he hadn't felt in 3 years. The nocturne flowed through his fingers like water, each phrase building on the last. He could feel the emotion in every note, all the longing and beauty that Chopin had written into the music more than a century ago. But it was also personal now, filled with his own story, his own heartbreak and hope. As he played, David thought about Lucy and Grace sleeping at home. They had never heard him play like this, had never seen this side of their father. He had been so focused on being responsible, on being the practical parent who could provide for them, that he had forgotten he could be other things too. What would they think if they could see him now? Would they be proud? Would they understand that their dad had once been someone who could make this kind of beauty? Or would they be confused about why he had hidden this part of himself from them? The nocturne began to wind toward its gentle ending, and David felt himself slowing down, savoring each of the final phrases. He didn't want this moment to end. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like himself again. Not just the tired single dad or the hard-working janitor, but the musician he had always been deep down. As the last note faded into silence, David sat very still with his hands resting on the keys. The theater seemed different somehow, as if the music had changed the very air around him. He could almost imagine an audience sitting in those empty seats, moved by what they had just heard. But the theater was still empty, and he was still just the night janitor who needed to finish his cleaning before morning came. David looked at his watch and felt a stab of panic. He had been playing for almost 30 minutes. His cart was still sitting by the stage, and he hadn't even started cleaning the theater seats yet. He stood up quickly, his legs stiff from sitting in one position for so long. As he closed the piano lid, he felt like he was closing a door on something precious. But what choice did he have? This wasn't his world anymore. He was just borrowing it for a few stolen minutes. David climbed down from the stage and went back to his cleaning cart. The mop and bucket suddenly felt heavier in his hands. The work that he had been doing for 3 years suddenly felt more difficult, as if playing those few pieces of music had reminded his body what it was really meant to do. He started working his way through the theater rows, picking up programs and candy wrappers, wiping down the armrests of the seats. But with every movement, the music was still playing in his head. His fingers still tingled with the memory of the piano keys, and he found himself humming softly under his breath. As David worked, he made himself a promise. Tomorrow night, after his daughters were asleep and his cleaning was done, he would come back to that piano, maybe just for a few minutes, maybe just to play one more song. He told himself it would be the last time, that he just needed to get this out of his system. But deep down, David knew something had changed tonight that couldn't be unchanged. The music was awake in him again, and no amount of practical thinking was going to put it back to sleep. For better or worse, he had remembered who he used to be, and for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't sure he could keep pretending to be someone else. What David didn't know was that he wasn't alone in the theater that night. In a small office 3 floors above the main hall, 5 members of the theater's board of directors were having an emergency meeting. They had been arguing for the past 2 hours about the theater's financial problems, and the discussion was getting heated. The Grand Theater was in trouble. Ticket sales had been dropping for months, and they were struggling to compete with the newer entertainment venues across town. Some board members wanted to sell the building to developers who would turn it into condos. Others insisted they could find a way to bring the theater back to life. Helen Wright, who had been on the board for 15 years, was getting frustrated with the whole conversation. She had given up her evening with her grandchildren to come to this meeting, and they seemed to be going in circles. The men around the table kept talking about budget cuts and marketing strategies, but nobody was talking about what really mattered, finding a way to connect with people again. "We need to face reality," said Robert Chen, the board's treasurer. "Classical music just doesn't draw crowds anymore. People want movies, they want pop concerts, they want—" He stopped talking suddenly. Everyone in the room had heard it at the same time. Piano music drifting up from somewhere below them. It was faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from the main theater. "Is there supposed to be someone practicing tonight?" asked Margaret Torres, looking confused. Helen checked the schedule on her phone. No, the theater should be empty except for the cleaning crew. The music continued, and it was beautiful. Even through the old building's floors and walls, they could hear the skill and emotion in the playing. This wasn't some amateur fooling around, this was serious musicianship. "Should we call security?" Robert whispered, though he seemed reluctant to interrupt the performance. Helen stood up from the conference table. "Let's go see what's happening." The 5 board members made their way quietly down the stairs, following the sound of the piano. With each floor they descended, the music became clearer and more powerful. By the time they reached the main level, they could hear every note perfectly. Helen pushed open the heavy door to the theater very slowly, just enough to peek inside. What she saw made her catch her breath. On the brightly lit stage sat a man in work clothes, jeans and a simple t-shirt, his cleaning cart visible at the side of the stage. His hands moved across the piano keys with the grace of a trained professional, and the music that filled the theater was absolutely stunning. She motioned for the others to look, and one by one they squeezed into the doorway. The man on stage was completely absorbed in his playing, his eyes closed, his whole body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the music. It was clear that he had no idea anyone was watching him. Margaret recognized him first. "That's David," she whispered. "He's been cleaning here for years." Helen had seen David many times before, of course. He was always polite when he passed board members in the hallways, always quick to move his cart out of the way if someone needed to get by. But she had never really looked at him, never thought of him as anything more than part of the building's invisible staff. Now she couldn't take her eyes off him. The piece he was playing was technically difficult. She knew enough about piano to recognize that. But more than the technical skill, there was something in the way he played that reached right into her chest and grabbed her heart. This was music with real feeling behind it, the kind of performance that made you forget everything else in the world. Robert, who had been arguing just minutes before that classical music was dead, found himself leaning forward to hear better. The treasurer, who dealt in numbers and budgets all day long, was completely captured by the emotion pouring from the piano. The 5 board members stood there in the darkened theater, not moving, barely breathing as David played piece after piece. Each song was more beautiful than the last, and it became clear that this wasn't just someone who knew a few songs. This was a trained musician, someone with real talent and years of serious study behind him. Helen felt tears starting in her eyes as she listened. This was exactly what the theater had been missing. Not flashier marketing or cheaper tickets, but this, real music played with real passion. The kind of performance that could remind people why live music mattered, why it was worth leaving their houses and paying money to experience something special. When David finally stopped playing, the silence in the theater felt almost sacred. The board members remained frozen in the doorway, not wanting to break the spell. They watched as David sat quietly at the piano for a long moment, then stood up and closed the lid over the keys. As he walked back to his cleaning cart, Helen made a decision. She stepped into the theater and began to clap. The sound of applause echoed through the empty hall, and David spun around in shock. His face went white when he saw the 5 well-dressed people standing at the back of the theater. He recognized all of them. Board members, important people, the kind of people who could fire him without a second thought. "I'm so sorry," David said, his voice shaking. "I know I shouldn't have been playing. I was just finishing up my cleaning, and I didn't mean any harm. Please, I need this job." Helen walked down the aisle toward the stage, still clapping. The other board members followed her, and their applause filled the theater. David looked terrified, like he was waiting for them to call the police. "David," Helen called out as she reached the front row, "how long have you been playing piano?" What?" David looked confused by the question. "Ma'am, I'm really sorry. I know the piano is expensive and I shouldn't have touched it without permission. Please don't fire me." "Nobody's going to fire you," Helen said gently. "But I asked you a question. How long have you been playing?" David looked around at the 5 faces watching him, trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap. "Since I was 8, he said finally. "But I haven't played much in recent years. I'm sorry," Margaret stepped forward. "Where did you study music?" "State University," David answered quietly. "I got a scholarship for piano performance, but that was a long time ago." The board members exchanged glances. Helen could see the same excitement in their eyes that she was feeling. This wasn't just about finding a talented musician. This was about finding someone who belonged to their community, someone who understood what the theater meant to people like them. "David," Helen said, "how would you feel about playing for people other than just us?" David stared at her like she had asked him to fly to the moon. "Ma'am? I mean really performing. On this stage, for a real audience." David shook his head quickly. "Oh no, I couldn't do that. I'm just the janitor here. I have kids to take care of, responsibilities. I can't." This was just a mistake. But Helen was already forming a plan in her mind. She looked at this man who had just filled their struggling theater with the most beautiful music she had heard in years, and she saw possibility everywhere. "David," she said, "I think you might be exactly what this place has been waiting for." David stood on the stage feeling like his legs might give out underneath him. The 5 board members were looking at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Not anger, which is what he had expected, but something else. Something that looked almost like excitement. Helen Wright walked closer to the stage, her heels clicking on the theater floor. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, and David had always thought she seemed like the type of person who would be patient with her grandchildren. But right now she was looking at him with an intensity that made him nervous. "David," she said, "I want you to tell me your story. The real story. How does someone with your musical ability end up working as a janitor?" David felt his face getting hot. These were important people, wealthy people who served on the theater board and made decisions about thousands of dollars. They probably thought his life was some kind of joke. A failed musician pushing a mop around the place where real artists performed. "It's not very interesting," he said quietly. "I studied music in college, but then life happened. My wife got sick and died, and I had 2 little girls to raise by myself. I needed steady work, so I took this job. That's all, repeated Robert, the treasurer. "David, what you just played up there, that wasn't that's all, that was extraordinary." David shook his head. "I'm out of practice. I haven't performed in years. I don't even have a decent piano at home." Helen climbed the steps to the stage, moving slowly and deliberately. David instinctively stepped back, but she held up her hand in a gesture that was meant to be reassuring. "David, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. When you were playing just now, how did it feel?" The question caught David off guard. How did it feel? Like coming home after being lost for 3 years? Like remembering who he used to be before everything fell apart? Like his wife was sitting in the front row again, smiling at him the way she used to during his college recitals? It felt. David started, then stopped. "It felt like something I shouldn't be doing. Why? Because I'm not that person anymore. I'm not a musician. I'm a single dad with bills to pay and kids to feed. I can't afford to dream about things like this." Helen nodded slowly, like she understood something about David's situation. "What if I told you that dreaming about this might actually help you take better care of your daughters?" David looked confused. "I don't understand." Margaret Torres, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "David, this theater is in trouble. We're struggling to find audiences, struggling to stay relevant. People don't seem to connect with classical music the way they used to. But tonight," added Robert, "listening to you play, I remembered why I fell in love with this music in the first place. You weren't just playing notes on a page. You were telling a story." Helen stepped closer to David. "We've been talking for months about how to save this place. We've considered every idea from pop concerts to comedy shows, but what we heard tonight was something different, something special." David was shaking his head before she even finished talking. "Whatever you're thinking, I can't do it. I have to work. I have responsibilities." "What if you could do both?" Helen asked. "What do you mean?" "What if we offered you a different position here? Something that would use your musical talents but also provide steady income?" David felt like the floor was shifting underneath him. "What kind of position?" Helen looked at the other board members, and David could see some kind of silent conversation happening between them. Finally, she turned back to him. "We've been talking about starting a community outreach program, something to bring music education to kids who might not otherwise get the chance to experience it. We need someone who understands both the music and what it's like to struggle, someone who could connect with families like yours." "I don't have any teaching experience," David said quickly. "But you have something more important," Margaret said. "You have the ability to make people feel something when you play. That's not something you can learn in a classroom." Helen continued. "The position would involve some teaching, some performing, some community work. It would pay more than your current job, and it would give you a platform to share your music with people who need to hear it." David's mind was racing. More money would mean he could get his daughters into better programs, maybe even save for their college education. But it also meant taking a huge risk. What if he wasn't good enough? What if people didn't respond to his playing, the way these board members had? "I would need to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," Helen said. "But before you decide, I want to ask you one more thing. When was the last time you played for your daughters?" The question hit David like a punch to the stomach. Lucy and Grace had never heard him play piano. They knew he had studied music in college, but he had never shared that part of himself with them. He had been so focused on being the responsible parent that he had forgotten about being the whole person. "I haven't," he admitted. "Why not?" David thought about the broken keyboard in his closet, about all those nights when he had played with headphones on so nobody would hear him. He thought about how he had convinced himself that music was a luxury he couldn't afford, something from his old life that didn't belong in his new reality. "I guess I thought it would just make things harder, like it would remind us all of things we couldn't have." Helen's voice was gentle when she spoke again. "David, your daughters lost their mother. That's a terrible thing and nothing can change it. But they don't have to lose their father's music too." Robert stepped forward. "We're not asking you to decide tonight, but we are asking you to consider that maybe your talent isn't something you need to hide from. Maybe it's something that could help other people the way it helped us tonight. Think about it this way," Margaret added. "You could keep cleaning this theater for the next 20 years, and that's honorable work. Or you could help us fill these seats with people who need to hear what you have to share." David looked out at the empty theater seats, trying to imagine them filled with people, families like his own maybe, kids who had never heard live classical music before, people who thought the theater was only for rich folks and didn't know that music could speak to anyone who was willing to listen. "How much time do I have to decide?" he asked. "Take a week," Helen said. "But David, I want you to do something for me during that week." "What?" "I want you to play for your daughters. I want you to let them see this side of who you are. And then I want you to ask yourself if this is something you want to keep hidden or something you want to share with the world." Helen handed David a business card with her phone number on it. "Call me when you're ready to talk." The 5 board members began to walk toward the exit, leaving David alone on the stage with his thoughts. Just before Helen reached the door, she turned back. "David, what you shared with us tonight was a gift. Don't let anyone convince you that gifts like that are meant to be buried." After they left, David stood in the empty theater for a long time, holding Helen's business card and thinking about his daughters sleeping at home. For the first time in 3 years, he was imagining a future that looked different from the present. And for the first time in 3 years, that future looked like it might include music. 3 weeks later, David stood backstage at the Grand Theater, wearing a black suit that Helen had insisted on buying for him. His hands were shaking and he couldn't seem to catch his breath. Through the curtains, he could hear the murmur of hundreds of people taking their seats in the theater that he had cleaned so many times. After that night when the board members discovered him playing, David had gone home and done exactly what Helen had asked. The next evening, after Lucy and Grace finished their homework, he had sat them down and told them he wanted to show them something special. He had pulled out the old keyboard from the closet and set it up in the living room. His daughters had looked confused at first. They had never seen this instrument before, had no idea their father even owned a piano. "I used to play music," David had told them simply. "Before you were born, before your mom got sick, I was studying to be a pianist." Lucy, the younger one, had asked why he stopped playing. David had tried to explain about responsibility and bills and taking care of them, but as he talked, he realized how hollow his reasons sounded. He wasn't protecting them by hiding his music. He was depriving them of knowing who their father really was, so he had play. Ed for them, simple songs at first, then some of the pieces he remembered from college. Lucy and Grace had sat on the couch with their eyes wide, listening to their father create something beautiful right there in their living room. "Dad, you're really good at this," Grace had said when he finished. "Why don't you play music for your job?" That question had haunted David for days. Why didn't he play music for his job? Because he was scared? Because he thought he wasn't good enough? Because it felt safer to keep his dreams small? When he finally called Helen Wright, David's voice had been steady. "I want to try," he had said. "I want to see if I can do this." The theater had moved quickly to set up David's first performance. They called it Hidden Talents, a community concert, and they had promoted it as a way to showcase the musical gifts that existed right in their own neighborhood. David would be the featured performer, but they had also invited other local musicians to participate. Helen had been smart about the marketing. Instead of positioning David as some kind of professional comeback story, she had framed him as proof that extraordinary talent could be found anywhere, even among the people who worked quietly behind the scenes to keep the community running. The response had been overwhelming. Tickets sold faster than they had for any concert in the past 2 years. People were curious about the janitor who could apparently play piano like a professional. Local news stations had picked up the story. David's phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests. But now, standing backstage and listening to the crowd, David wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. What if he forgot the music? What if his hand seized up from nerves? What if people expected something he couldn't deliver? Helen appeared beside him, wearing an elegant blue dress and the kind of confident smile that David wished he could borrow. "How are you feeling?" she asked, terrified. David admitted. "Good. That means this matters to you." She handed him a bottle of water and gestured toward 2 seats in the front row that David could see through a gap in the curtain. Lucy and Grace were sitting there wearing their best dresses, their faces shining with excitement. Mrs. Rodriguez, the neighbor who had been watching them for years, was sitting between them. "Your daughters look proud," Helen said. David felt his throat get tight as he looked at his girls. They had been so excited about tonight that they could barely sleep for the past week. Grace had told her entire 3rd grade class that her father was going to be a real performer. Lucy had drawn pictures of David at the piano and hung them on the refrigerator. "Helen," David said quietly, "what if I'm not as good as you think I am?" She turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "David, let me tell you something. I've been involved with this theater for 15 years. I've heard hundreds of professional musicians perform on this stage. Some of them were technically perfect and completely forgettable. Others made mistakes but created something magical." She paused, looking out at the growing crowd. "What you played that night 3 weeks ago wasn't just music. It was your story, your heart, your experience of loss and love and hope. That's not something you can fake, and it's not something you can lose just because you're nervous." The theater manager appeared and signaled that it was time to begin. David's heart started pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "Remember," Helen said as she walked toward the stage to introduce him, "these people aren't here to judge you. They're here because they want to be moved by something real." David heard Helen's voice over the sound system as she welcomed the audience and told them about the evening's special performer. She talked about talent hiding in unexpected places, about the music that lives inside ordinary people, about the janitor who had been sharing the building with greatness all along. Then she called his name, and David walked out onto the stage where he had spent 3 years cleaning and dreaming. The applause was warm and encouraging, but David barely heard it. He was focused on the piano bench, on getting to that familiar place where he could sit down and let the music take over. As he settled at the keyboard, he looked out at the audience for the first time. The theater was completely full. Every seat was occupied and people were standing in the back. But David's eyes went straight to the front row, where Lucy and Grace were beaming at him with pure love and excitement. He had planned to start with Bach, the same piece he had been playing that night when the board members discovered him. But as he placed his hands on the keys, David found himself thinking about his wife, about how proud she would be to see him on this stage. Without planning it, he began to play the Chopin nocturne that had been her favorite. The first notes rang out clear and strong, filling every corner of the theater. David felt his nervousness dissolve as the familiar music flowed through his fingers. This was where he belonged, not because he was the best pianist in the world, but because he had something to say through his music, and people needed to hear it. As the piece developed, David could feel the audience settling into the music with him. The theater became completely quiet except for the piano, and in that silence, David felt connected to every person in the room. They were all there together, sharing something beautiful, something that lifted them above their everyday worries and reminded them what it meant to be human. When the nocturne ended, the applause was thunderous. People were on their feet, and David could see tears on many faces. But the most important faces were in the front row, where his daughters were clapping so hard their hands must have been sore. David played 4 more pieces that night, each one building on the last. He played Bach and Chopin and a piece he had written himself years ago, when he still thought anything was possible. With each song, he felt more confident, more like the musician he had always been underneath the uniform of the night janitor. For his final piece, David spoke to the audience for the first time. "This last song," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the theater, "is for my daughters Lucy and Grace, and for anyone who has ever been told that their dreams are too big or too impractical. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to let the music inside us go silent. He played a lively piece by Rachmaninoff, something joyful and hopeful that seemed to dance off his fingers. When he finished, the standing ovation went on for almost 5 minutes. Later, after the theater had emptied and David had shaken hands with what felt like hundreds of people, Helen found him sitting at the piano one more time. "So," she said, "how does it feel to be a performing musician again?" David smiled, looking out at the empty seats where so many people had shared his music tonight. "It feels like coming home." Helen handed him a contract. "Then let's make it official. Welcome to your new life, David." As he signed his name, David thought about all the nights he had cleaned this theater, never imagining that someday he would be the one on stage. Sometimes the best things in life were waiting right where you were, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone to believe they were possible.